Welcome to another segment of Ecosystem TV. I'm going to have a very fascinating discussion today that brings together design, the built environment, cities, governments, and of course, all centered around the theme of sustainability. And it's my pleasure today to welcome a leader who's actually been very, very involved in this way before it became mainstream. So Chintan Raveshia, who's an architect himself, has been a big proponent of sustainable cities and actually leads the Southeast Asia practice for Arup, which is one of the world's leading design and sustainability focused firms with a very strong presence in Asia Pacific. Chintan also heads the Center for Climate Action in Cities for Arup. And that's a think tank that actually leads some of the efforts to create much more sustainable cities for us. So welcome, Chintan. Really pleased to have you.
Thanks, Amit. It's an absolute pleasure to come here as well. And thanks for the invite.
Oh, my pleasure. And look, we have had you on sessions before. I've heard you speak. And we've had a lot of conversations in the past around some of the things that you do and things that we take for granted around the built environment that's built around us and how much thought process and planning actually goes into it. And it's quite a marvel when you think about it. When we plan, like in our world, Chintan, when we plan product development and stuff, we're thinking of sprints, like the next 6 months, the next 2 weeks, literally. You're building plans that will shape, possibly in some instances, through your own lifetime. That needs a lot of patience for, to wait for them to kind of come to fruition. So it does require quite a strong vision and commitment towards achieving that. So I'm actually really fascinated. And I'd love to know more about Arup, just for our audience, in terms of what it is that you guys do and what sets you apart.
Arup is a built environment firm. So we are a group of planners, designers, engineers, economists, architects who work together to achieve one clear objective, which is developing a truly sustainable built environment. We are, I think, how is it now? I think we are more than 70 to 80 years old. We started in London, and now we are around more than 19,000 people across the world. So yeah, in my role here as a cities lead for Arup's business in Southeast Asia, we do everything from developing city strategies for governments to think about their future overall. So we're currently been helping Singapore for their energy strategy, for example, to planning big cities, future cities, new cities, or even retrofitting existing cities, to design and engineering the next generation net zero buildings. For example, we are working on the new Changi Terminal T5 right now and thinking about it, of course, and as you pointed out, the next 5-10 years, the buildings have to be climate positive, if not net zero. And how do you achieve that? So that's our day-to-day job of thinking about how do we think about a future that needs to be net zero or more so climate positive.
Lots of stakeholders do you have to work with in this regard? Because if you're just doing a building, I would imagine you still have there's a lot that goes into it. And there's a set of stakeholders that come in. How does that process work? Where does it even start and where does it end in terms of the plans getting the go-ahead?
That's interesting. Especially when you think about these massive, huge developments, and we'll probably speak about that later. But when we're planning something where, let's say a new city, where someone's going to move in, or families are going to move in, not even 5, probably 7, 8, 10 years from now. So we're talking about in 2030s. Like you think about your plans as 2 weeks, 4 weeks for that matter, 6 weeks.
Yep.
We need to think about what is going to excite you to move to a brand new place 10 years from now. And that requires, of course, future thinking, future gazing. But at the same time, we got to think about how flexible can we plan our things so that 10 years from now, things need to change. It can change seamlessly. And of course, you have the usual stakeholders, which is you need to have the governments with you. You need to have the financiers or funders of these big developments on your side. You need to have all agencies, how are you going to manage waste, water, energy, etc. All of those coming together. Believe it or not, the most important stakeholder there are two most important stakeholders in all these conversations. One is the people you want to attract and retain them in the new city. So the residents, they become the biggest stakeholders of the future. and of the future. You have to remember that, because the stakeholder you're talking to are probably not the ones who are going to move there. Probably the kids are going to move there.
That's right.
And the other one is literally, I say the topmost stakeholder in any of my conversations actually is nature. Nature has to be an absolute stakeholder in every conversation in terms of anything that we do. How does it work with the biodiversity, the flora, the fauna, the birds, the animals are in that place, and how do you work with that or them to get a better future? So it's literally getting all of those ducks in the row, and most of the times they're never in the row, and you change how the ducks move one after the other as you go through the process.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, there's I would imagine a lot of research that goes into this process to actually understand every aspect of that ecosystem, the biodiversity, the financial ecosystem, what's going to be driving commercial interests for people to be there, the commutes for people, what's the office landscape going to look like. So as you do that, do you guys do a lot of that research yourself?
Yeah, in most cases, a good portion of the research is done by us, but we never shy away from having the best minds and best partners along with us on the journey to look at things. And no one should be saying it, and we definitely don't say that we have the brains for everything under the sun to make a best city in the world. So I think we connect a lot with people who are already in the thing. You spoke earlier before we got on this call about people who are engaged with the civic society. We sometimes work with them, so the social agencies for that matter, connect a lot with them to build thought thinking, research what the likes and desires are, work with real estate agencies, exactly what you talked about in terms of what will attract a developer to come to a brand new city, to put in that money and take the risk, especially I would say the phase one of a city. And when there's nothing there and you have the first 100 buildings coming in there, who are the ones who are going to put in the money there, and how much is government going to invest in there so that the developers think I think this is going to be a success. Those are the right people we get on board with.
I actually want to jump into sort of, to me, one of the most fascinating projects that I'm seeing in Asia, or actually for that matter, anywhere, is the development of the new capital city. When you started your career, you went to architecture school. Did you actually think that, hey, one day I'm going to be involved in actually shaping the capital of one of the largest countries of the world?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yes, I did do my architecture first, and I very quickly realized by the time I finished architecture that I actually did not like designing buildings. I actually like designing urban areas. So that's when I decided to go and do my urban design. By the time I got to London, and then I joined Arup in London actually, because Arup was the first one to start thinking about, and you mentioned that when it was not mainstream, was designing eco-cities in China when no one was talking about eco-cities in early 2000s. And I was like, where could I do these big things? So then I moved to London, and I started going to Shanghai and China back and forth in 2006 to think about how do we even think about it. I didn't know that you had to think about all these other cogs in the wheels that had come together to make a city. So there's those long journeys and moving across the world, eventually coming here to Singapore in 2015, still not knowing that 3 or 4 years later, I'll get the opportunity to lead the plan for the third most populous country in the world's new capital city in the 21st century. So yes, it has been an amazing journey.
Yeah, tell us a bit more about that experience. It's really the one that will actually impact, I guess, for us living in Southeast Asia, probably the biggest initiative that we're going to see from a planning perspective.
2018 it was. So you have to realize it is pre-COVID. The world was a very, very different place then. Is when we got on to developing the plan for Indonesia's new capital city, which is 256,000 hectares. And if you think about it in terms of size, it's probably 5 times the size of Singapore. And we had to start thinking about a blank piece of paper almost. Of course, not so blank, because you have a lot of flora, fauna, again, a lot of nature there. There are existing population there in certain areas where it sits. There is a lot of biodiversity that exists there. So that was our blank piece of paper. So to start with, think about what that future should be. I think probably the most interesting and equally challenging part of that was having 100+ ministerial people in one room, and we literally went through a workshop process, think about what are the goods and the bads in the world in terms of examples of what we should not do and what we should
Yep.
do. As simple as highways, 6-lane highways for a city, bad thing. Cycle lanes with green areas, good thing. We literally went through that process to kind of work with people's behaviors and thinking in terms of what we want to expect. So the first 2 months, we literally did not put any pen on paper. And as an urban designer, that was like a big thing to not start designing. No, we did not. We actually ran vision and objectives workshops so everyone to be aligned on the same vision and objectives to finally say, okay, now we'll put pen on paper to say that anything and everything that we do should connect to the objectives and visions that we all agreed on the top there, and eventually develop. And we actually now have a book of, I think, 2,000, close to 2,000 KPIs to achieve that net zero city, which has gone into an application and done and dusted. So if anyone, a developer goes and builds something in 2035, they need to adhere to those KPIs. That's been the journey. And then, of course, COVID hit in the middle, and then we still were working on the plans. And 2021, we finally finished that work, and now we're still continuing to work, but from a very different angle.
And when do you anticipate, if you're able to talk about it, that you actually see that city start to shape up and people start to move in?
Well, we are not party to the implementation of the city.
Sure.
I think that's in the hands of the government agencies that are taking care of it. But from what I hear, and we actually we were just talking about it, that there was Ecosperity event happening in Singapore this week, and the President Jokowi was actually here in Singapore, and he presented the whole scheme and spoke about how they are going to have close to 200,000 people moving in the next 2 years there. So that's the start of the first phase. So there you go.
That is amazing. I mean, that requires some pretty heavy lift. What do you think are the motivations for governments to take these steps? Because, you know, this is obviously a great way to be a flag bearer for a nation to move towards sustainable living for, you know, not just from a biodiversity standpoint, but also giving their own population a better environment to be in and be part of that biodiversity. So what are the motivations you think for stakeholders to make these big, bold, progressive decisions?
Some of them are quite practical. I completely support the idea that Indonesia needed to move its capital from Jakarta. Jakarta needs space to breathe and breathe as a financial capital. I think there's just too much load on it. And plus, we all know that Jakarta is sinking and all the other issues around climate that's causing it. So the move, I completely get it in terms of pure practicality, completely supportive of that. But also, as you said, I think, and I've always mentioned that to the ministers, everyone's agreed to that, is that we have to realize that we're building, this is probably the first capital city to be built in the 21st century in the climate emergency era. And probably others have heard me say this before, that it has to live, breathe, behave, operate, experience different than any of the other cities we've ever lived till date in our lives. Because everything that you're experiencing right now is what was thought about in 20th century. Nothing that we know right now should be drawn and designed, and the buildings that you see behind your screen should be like that. We cannot, because we cannot afford to even be net zero. Our future needs to be regenerative and climate positive for us to mend what we have screwed up the world right now as we speak. So that is the premise that we started with. And that is the premise that the government has, that you have the way to look at, you are the first one to think about this in this century, in this era, and your city has to be almost like a trademark for any other city that comes in the world in the future to say, this is how a future living should be.